Hi, welcome to this video on an introduction to jQuery. This is a short video that's designed to give you just sort of a taste of what it's like to work with jQuery and how you go about incorporating it into a web page in preparation for making a small web app. This is designed to be complementary with a more extensive training in jQuery usage. My name is Professor J Patterson. So, at a high level, the key points that I want to communicate in this lecture are that JavaScript is the way that we add interactivity to a web page. But jQuery is a library that's written for JavaScript that makes it easier to work with JavaScript by providing a simpler syntax and giving you a lot of powerful actions that help you to manipulate the document object model. If you'll recall, there are three primary languages that make up core web applications. We've got HTML, which is sort of where your web page starts. It is the content of your web page, but it's just the content of your web page. It is typically paired with something that is written in CSS or cascading style sheets, and together with the content and CSS, HTML providing the content, CSS provides the presentation, the aesthetics of your web page. What are the background colors and the fonts? How are the colors of your text, and where are your images laid out? And what does it look like to position the different elements on your page? That's what CSS gives you. The third thing that's important for a website or a web application is interactivity. How do you get a website to do things when you click on it? The button itself is governed by CSS and HTML, but what happens when you click on a button? That's governed by JavaScript. Since different browsers have slightly different tweaks to the way that their JavaScript works, a library like jQuery, which is a JavaScript component, but is in addition to what comes natively with your browser, jQuery gives you the ability to write code that's going to work in several different browsers, and it's a little bit more powerful than just JavaScript as it comes out of the box with your browser. Together, content, presentation, and interactivity form the foundations of any web application. So what is jQuery in particular? Well, like I said, it's a JavaScript library, meaning it's a bunch of JavaScript that's been put together and to work into a particular way to make it more convenient for you to work with JavaScript. It has cross-browser compatibility. That means it's going to work in Safari and Chrome. It's going to work in Firefox. It's going to work on a Windows computer or a Mac computer or a Linux computer. It's going to work on a mobile phone. It's cross-browser compatible. It also happens to be free. It supports things like manipulating the HTML elements. So you have a HTML document that gets structured as a tree, and those different components of the tree can be changed, additional components can be added to them, pieces can be swapped around, or they can be modified. And the way that happens is through a JavaScript command, and more easily, a jQuery command. One of the ways we might want to manipulate the document object model is by animating things, maybe disappearing or appearing, maybe animating things moving across the page in some way. jQuery supports that. jQuery helps to support event handling. An event is something like clicking on a button or receiving a message from a remote server. These kinds of events are made a little bit easier to manage and manipulate with jQuery. And finally, jQuery supports AJAX interaction. AJAX stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML, but you can just think of it as requesting information from a remote server. For example, if you have a website that's getting updates from a social media site like Twitter or Instagram, you might be doing that via AJAX. Let me take a second here, though, and describe what I mean by free. In software, the idea of free is made a little bit more complicated because of the English language. Sometimes when you hear people talking about free, they'll qualify in the context of software, they'll talk about it in terms of saying free as in beer and free as in speech. Two different ways in which the word free can be used. Now this is a conflation of two ideas in the English language, free meaning no cost and free meaning liberty. In other languages, for example Spanish, these two ideas are translated separately. For example, the free as in free beer, no cost, $0, that gets translated as gratis, meaning no cost. And if we talk about free as in free speech, that gets translated as libre or liberty or freedom. unfortunately, in English, we only have one word to describe those two things. So when people say free software, it's not clear which one of those they're talking about. Well, in fact, we're talking about both of them. Free software or open source software is both a way of distributing software where it's free for anyone to use it, but it's also promotes liberty by allowing people to be able to see the software source code that's written and to be able to use it in any way that they want. One of the things that this prevents is it prevents people who are using open source software from being surveilled against their knowledge, because people can look at the source code and see what it's doing, and there's no mysteries hidden in it for those who are skilled enough to be able to read the source code. So sometimes what we hear is this term free being replaced by a term called FLOSS. And that's an acronym that's mixed languages, and it stands for free or libre open source software. And so if it's FLOSS, if this is a FLOSS system, we're talking about free in both those senses. Free in cost, but free also because it promotes freedom, because you can use that source code and modify it without having to pay anyone for it. Side note is, well, how does anyone make money if they're not going to be able to sell software? And the answer is that if you want to make money selling software, if you want to make money with free or libre open source software, you can do it by selling services. Because just because software is free doesn't mean it's easy to use. And it might be helpful to have someone who's able to administer that software, even if it's open source. So for example, you could be a database administrator, and you might be working with free software, but it's still worth your time. It's still worth your employer's time to pay you to manage that free software. So rather than paying for the software, you're paying for the expertise of the person who knows how to use it. So that's just a little sidebar. There's a whole literature on free software that's out there that's very interesting if you're interested in looking at something a little bit more humanities related than technical. All right, but for us, we need to be able to get jQuery into our website, meaning we need the JavaScript that's running in our website to be able to use the jQuery library. jQuery is available from a website, an organization that produces this software, volunteer effort, on jQuery.org. So you can't just call jQuery, you need to get it into your website, and there's normally three primary ways in which you get this software into your website. The first is that you can download it from the jQuery website, and you can store the software on your own server. And so if you're following along with the Reversi application that's being made as part of this video series, you'll know that we have a directory, which is public/js, where we're putting our JavaScript files. You can download the JavaScript file from jQuery and put the jQuery file there if you'd like to use it and distribute it with your own source code repository and would like to have it as part of your own website. That's one way to do it. It's a perfectly reasonable way to do it. A second way that you can do it is you can include the jQuery library from a remote data site such as Google. This requires a browser who's using your website to be able to access two different servers. The server that you run that hosts your website, but also Google's server that's hosting this community version of jQuery. Now, why in the world would you want to use a version hosted by Google? Well, caching behavior is the primary reason why that's a value. If other websites are also using the jQuery library, when a web browser goes and loads up your website, if you're also using the same copy of the jQuery library, it will already be in the browser cache because a user has looked at a different website that used the same file. So by virtue of Google being such a large organization and so widely known, and whose hosting capabilities are so readily available, it appears as if your website will load much faster because this jQuery library happens to already be on a user's website. So that's one reason why you might want to do it. Another reason why you might want to do it is to save space on your website. A third way to get this library into your website is very similar to the situation with Google. You can load it from a content delivery network. This is just a different server other than Google that might host the jQuery library, and you might do that because you don't, for philosophical reasons or whatever reasons you might have, you might not want to host it on Google, but you might not want to keep it on your website. And so there are a variety of content delivery networks that will host that file for you and possibly host that file for you at a location that's close to the user that's loading your website. And so it will appear that even if they do have to load it because it's not in the cache, it will appear as if it loads very fast because it's not coming from halfway around the planet. It's just coming from a server near them. So 3 different ways of getting jQuery into your website. Host it yourself, use Google's hosting service, or use someone else's hosting service. Loading jQuery requires you to put a little bit of code into your JavaScript in order to get it. And we can use those 3 different mechanisms in order to get the software into our website. Now, we've already been doing this in the tutorial up to this point. We've been getting external JavaScript from other locations, notably to run our Bootstrap framework. So let's take a look at how we're doing that already. This is an example of the source code that we've been working with our Reversi application. Small font. Let me zoom in for us here. And I'm focusing down on the bottom. It is a best known practice to put your script tags at the bottom of your HTML. And the reason why you choose to do that, or you might choose to do that, is because as the client's web browser loads the HTML, it will proceed from the top to the bottom, rendering your website. And if it gets to the bottom, and that's the first place that the script tags are located, if it requires the browser to go out and get a non-cached copy, the rest of the web page can be partially drawn before you have to wait for the network request to get these JavaScript files and come back. So by putting them at the bottom, the user sees something at least partially rendered while it waits for the remote JavaScript to load up. Now this isn't a lot of time, but it's a notably better user experience to have something showing on the page than a mystery white canvas until the JavaScript loads from a remote server. In any event, we have 3 different script tags located at the bottom of this file, and they're loading in 3 different ways. The first one is loading from a content delivery network. You'll notice that, let me highlight this here. It looks a little complicated, but if you break it down in the way that XML is formatted, you can see it's not actually that complicated. We have the red text here, which is the tag, and we have an opening tag and a closing tag, script and /script. The opening part of the tag has 3 attributes: an SRC attribute for the source location, an integrity attribute for the fingerprint of that file, and then a cross-origin attribute indicating that it's okay to go to a remote site to get this JavaScript file. If you look at the source attribute, you can see it's just an IRI or a URL. It's a long one and it's complicated, but the components are all there. You can see the protocol, you can see the hosting site, you can see the path name. And what that is that's a location. CDN at the beginning of that IRI stands for Content Delivery Network. And it's an organization that is hosting a Bootstrap file. In this case, it happens to be a JavaScript component of Bootstrap. And it's located on a remote site, a Content Delivery Network. We need an integrity attribute because it's not coming from our website. But that's one of the 3 different ways in which you can load a JavaScript file of any kind. Now, this particular line, while it is a Content Delivery Network, is not getting the jQuery library. But the mechanism is here, so we'll look at that in a second. The second example of JavaScript remote loading that we have in this file that we've used already is loading the jQuery. This is loading the jQuery library from the Google-hosted server. You can see that we're using a website that's called googleapis.com, where it looks like we're loading version 3.6. And because it's a remote server, we also need that fingerprint or that integrity attribute that we get from the website srihash.org. Finally, the third example of loading a script is just a local JavaScript that we've written on our own. This is a file that's hosted on our website, right next to this index.html file, in a subfolder assets and in a subfolder JS for JavaScript. The file main.js can be found in our repository. Because this is coming from the same source as this whole file is coming from, as this index.html file is coming from, it's not necessary to have the integrity attribute. It's considered secure, not a security risk, to get a file from the same website. 3 different examples: content delivery network, Google-hosted content, and then a locally hosted content. The second one is the one that's getting jQuery in this case. All right, so how does jQuery actually work? We've talked about where we get it from. We talked a little bit about its background. What do we actually do with it? Well, the primary thing that you do with jQuery is you manipulate elements of the document object model. And because of that, the primary place where you use it is on client-side JavaScript. Although sometimes the utilities that come with jQuery are useful enough that you include it in server-side, mostly what you do with it is you use it to manipulate the document object model. And the document object model only exists in the browser. So we can select elements of that HTML and we can perform actions on it. Now the basic syntax is as shown here on that first indented bullet point. It consists of a $, which is the name of the function that calls all of jQuery's library. Then it's followed by a parameter in orange there called the selector. This identifies which elements of the document object model we want to manipulate. And then the blue portion there represents the action that we want to take on those elements that we've selected. The color is just for me to teach you what's happening here. In your code, the color doesn't mean anything. The code doesn't mean anything to the computer. It means something to people who are looking at it, but that's it. So the $ is used to define jQuery. It is equivalent to use the $ selector action syntax or to use the full word jQuery and then the selector and action syntax. These are both the same. People prefer the $ because it's just less typing to do. Some other libraries that you might want to include in your website sometimes also want to use the $, and so knowing that there is an alternative to using the $ is helpful if you have libraries that are clashing with one another. A selector is used to query or to find elements of our HTML document, elements of our document object model, and then the action is what we're going to do with those elements that we find. So let's break that down a little bit more. The selector language that we use is the same as CSS, or cascading style sheets. So it's convenient because cascading style sheets are used to apply formatting to elements of the HTML document object model. And so we're going to use that same language to do actions on the document object model. So we might have some CSS that looks like this. This is a bit of CSS formatting. This could be in an inline script. It could be in an external CSS file. Sorry, an inline CSS file or an external CSS file. But what it says is it says that all elements within my HTML page that have the H2 tag or the H3 tag or the A tag should all have their font size doubled. That's what it means as a CSS rule. That's how we use it as a CSS rule. We can also use that same selector, that first part, H2, H3, A, as a selector in our jQuery call. So our first indented bullet point here shows in the orange H1, H3, and A. That means that we're going to select all of the same elements that CSS rule targets, but instead of applying the font to it, we're going to apply some action to it. And I'm leaving it blue and undefined right now because right now I just want to talk about selecting elements. We'll get to the actions in a second. Here's another example of how we might target just H1 tags in our document object model, turning all of the text that's located there blue. We can also target H1 elements using jQuery, using the same selector, H1. Now notice when we specify our selector, we're specifying them in strings. So we're making a string with double quotes in this case, and we're putting the tag that we care about, or the multiple tags that we care about, as the parameter to the first part of our jQuery call. Finally, here's an example of selecting all the P tags in our document. Our CSS might color them red with a font and a font size, put a border around them, 2 pixels solid green. That's fine for CSS, but we can use that same selector to apply some other kind of action to that node. So here's an example of how we might use it. We're going to apply the hide action. The hide action is an action that's provided by jQuery that causes this particular element to disappear from our web page. Maybe we want to make it not eligible to be seen until the user takes some other action. Maybe it's something that we want to reveal only when the user asks for more information, but we can do that with the hide action or the corresponding show action. We can put that together here using kind of selectors like this. Now these selectors are all going to select multiple elements in this short little snippet of HTML that I show here. So this short snippet of HTML has words, more words, even more words, and then an image that doesn't actually have a source, but I'm just putting it there for selectors. Our first example here, once we have our whole file, and if we look at our first example of selecting the P tags and hiding them, what's going to happen is that we're going to end up hiding 3 different components of our website. All of those components that have the P tag. That means that words, more words, and even more words, when this bit of code is run, are going to be hidden from the user. The second example is going to select all those elements in our document object model who have the class of foo. Now in the CSS selector and in the jQuery selector, we use .foo you use the dot to indicate a class. But in the actual HTML, we don't have the dot there. We just use the word foo in order to specify a class. So in this case, using a different selector, we would have 3 different things be hidden. Words, even more words than that image. In this third example, we're being more specific. We're saying only those paragraph tags that also have the class of foo are going to be hidden. And so in this case, we're only going to delete 2 elements, words and even more words. So 3 different queries coupled with appropriate HTML gives us the ability to hide and show different elements in our document object model using jQuery. Here's an example of how we might just select one element. We're going to use the knowledge that ID tags are supposed to be unique. And because an ID tag is supposed to be unique, there should only be one element in our HTML document that has the ID of bar. So we'll use the same syntax that we used for CSS to isolate an element with the ID bar. We'll use hashtag bar. Hashtag bar will be hidden, and so in this case we'll lose this one particular element from visibility in the document. And you can see that like the class is specified with a dot, the ID is specified with a hashtag. But when we put it in the HTML, we don't use the dot and we don't use the hashtag. That's just to indicate that we're talking about an ID or a class respectively. Here's an example of specifying a selector in which, note, we're not using strings. We put the word this into the first section of our jQuery operator, our selector, and in this case, this is being treated as a variable. This is a special context-dependent way of hiding things. I'll give you an example of how this is used at the end of this lecture, but just reading this code right here, it's not clear what's going to be targeted without having more information about how this jQuery is being run and what this is being set to within the context of our code. The important thing to notice here is that it's a variable, it's not in a string. All right, so we can use all the very elaborate selectors that are available to us in our CSS language, in our jQuery language. For example, we can select multiple tags. So if we wanted to hide all of the p tags and all of the image tags, we could use the comma, because that's what a comma does in the selector. It selects both of those independently. We could also select those a tags that are a descendant of a p tag. So if we put a p, a space, and an a, the way that's interpreted is any a tags that are a descendant of a p tag, and not necessarily an immediate descendant, but it could be several layers deep. So we'll hide all of those. In the third example, we're going to hide all elements that have a class of next, but that also have a sibling of class previous. So this is getting pretty specific and sort of niche about what we're trying to hide here. And maybe this is to hide, everything but the first paragraph in a blog where you're just trying to show a snippet of the text until someone clicks more or something like that. Finally, in the fourth example, you see a very detailed way of specifying that you want to hide all of the input elements that are not checked. And so this is an example of maybe a form where you want to hide things that aren't checked, maybe after you validated a form or something like that, to summarize it and save visual space. This is just mostly a reminder that CSS is a very powerful selector language, and that power is also available in the context of jQuery. What other kinds of actions are available? Well, the kind of actions that I'm mostly going to demonstrate in this lecture are ones that have a corresponding visual component, because those are the things that are easiest to get your head around. But there are many things that a jQuery operator can do. You can append additional content to a document object model. So let's say that you have, for example, a list of tweets that are coming in, and you get a notification from a server that a new tweet has arrived. You can use jQuery to create a new paragraph tag and throw that on the bottom of your list of tweets that you already have. Maybe you would like to wrap some content that you presently have in a div tag. So maybe you'd like to sort of push it down and make it a child of another div tag so that you can apply some styling to it independently. You could wrap some content. You could toggle the display of some document object model. So you could have a button that causes content to appear or disappear, and every time you click it, it does the opposite. You can also use jQuery to attach functions to objects. And the most obvious one that you would typically use is to have a button on your web page and to use jQuery to attach some interactivity to that button so that when you click on that button, you run the function that you attached with jQuery. And we'll look at a lot of examples of that in just a sec. And then finally, you can request external information using an AJAX pattern. This is a kind of pattern where you request information and you don't know how long it's going to take to come back, but when it does, you're able to handle that response. That's more of a network approach to using jQuery, or it's a network operation that you can do with jQuery. All right, so here are 10 examples where we're going to take some HTML, and mostly we're going to just be using the default CSS, but we're going to add interactivity using JavaScript, and in particular, I want to show you how to get jQuery in the mix as well. So here's our first example, just to get us set up. We have a little web page shown in a browser, in a phone, vertical phone portrait format, of a picture of coffee beans shaped in a heart shape, because I heart coffee. It's my lifeblood. I actually got some blood in my coffee system once. It was a little drastic. So we're also going to put a button at the top, and the button says "Click Me." All right. So at first we're going to start, and there's going to be no interaction. So let me show you what the HTML looks like, and then we'll build up from here. So here's an example of the HTML. It is basically the Bootstrap template. We have the standard boilerplate for our doc type and our HTML. As we come through our head, we have our standard boilerplate for meta and meta. We have standard boilerplate for link that's going to go out to a content delivery network and get our Bootstrap CSS file. We have our title tag, which you actually don't see in the screenshot here because I took too narrow of a screenshot. And then in the body, you can see we're using Bootstrap responsive design. We have a fluid container that wraps all of our content. We have 2 rows. Our first row has 1 column, and that row has a level 3 margin around it. We have an extra div tag that's in our first column, which helps to put everything centered in the web page. And in that first and only column in our first row, we have a button. And the ID of the button is the capital B button. The text that's written on the button says "Click Me," but you can see there's no other interactivity that's attached to this button in this line. Then as we proceed to our second row, you can see we have a row, a column, and then our centering div. And in that row and in that column, we have a fluid image, which would resize according to the different sizes of the browser. And it is referencing an external image file that's also located on this website. And we've given this particular image element in our document object model the ID of the capital I image. We've also included an alt tag for text to screen readers to be able to read what's there. Coffee beans and a heart. Finally, at the bottom of our HTML, you can see we're going out to a content delivery network and we're getting the JavaScript associated with Bootstrap. And so this is just the boilerplate Bootstrap. No interactivity. And so when we bring this up and we try and interact with it, we might click on the button and we get just sort of the general gloss of the fact that we've clicked on it from Bootstrap. But other than that sort of default behavior of just highlighting briefly, no work is being done. Just the highlight, the user interface kind of feedback that we would expect from a high quality interface. But it doesn't actually do anything. So let's fix that. Let's have it actually do something. So example number 2 of 10, let's install some JavaScript, put some inline JavaScript in there, but not jQuery yet. All right, so what might that look like? All right, so here's some JavaScript for us. It's not the whole file because it's getting a little bit larger than what we can read. But what I mostly want to draw your attention to is line 23 and 24, where we modified the HTML associated with the button. And we've manually added this onClick attribute. And in the string that's assigned to the onClick attribute is a JavaScript function that's called the button function. By providing this onClick attribute, that's one way that you can communicate to the browser of what you would like the browser to do when the user clicks on this element. So what we're communicating to the browser here is when the user clicks on this button, we want the browser to run the function called the button function. That's fine, but we also have to provide that function. And notably, we have to be very careful of how we spell it. We've got to get all the characters right, the spelling right, and the capitalization right. and we have to define it somewhere. In this example, I'm defining it in an inline script tag. Just like you can have inline CSS, you can also have inline script. And that's located here at the top at line 12 and going down to line 16. What you see here is that what the function, the button function, does is it causes a web page alert to pop up with the text, "You clicked me." So let's see what that looks like when we run it. We have our basic web browser rendered here, a phone format, a form factor. Let's run this and see what happens when we click. We hit click me and the alert button comes up. We can do it multiple times and we can clear that. And so what we've done is we've attached some interactivity to our click me button by using the attribute line in our HTML and providing a function that responds to the click. All right, let's extend this. Let's change our file so that we're not using inline script anymore, but we're going to use external JavaScript. Still no jQuery though. All right, what does that look like? Here's basically the same setup, but I want to draw your attention to two things. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is that we have lost our inline script at the top. So if you look at line 4 to 10, there's no script tag there anymore. We've removed it. And instead, down on line 32, we've added a link to an external JavaScript file that's hosted on my server called script_3.js. The contents of that file are pretty straightforward. Let me show them to you here. It's just this text. There's no tags around it or anything like that. It's just the contents of what was in the script tag before. The button function, alert, clicked me. You can see that on line 17 in the HTML file, we still have a reference to the button function associated with the on-click attribute of the button itself. I think the click me got cut off on the right there, unfortunately. All right, so what does it look like when we run this now? Well, it's going to look exactly the same, actually. Because the functionality is the same, it's just the architecture that's slightly different. Let's see if I can get this to run. There we go. We click on the button, nothing, we get the alert, we click on the heart, nothing happens. Pretty straightforward. All right, let's look at example 4 of 10. Now we're going to use external JavaScript like before, and now we're going to use jQuery, and we're going to use jQuery to attach the function instead of the attribute. So let's look at the source code for this. So first take a look at line 16. On the click me button, we've removed that on click attribute. So as the HTML is written right now, the browser has no idea what to do if a user clicks on click me. However, also notice that down at the bottom, if we look at line 31, we're loading the jQuery library now from an external site. We're loading it from the jQuery website itself, actually. After we've loaded the Bootstrap code in line 28, we load jQuery in line 31, and then in line 34, we load our JavaScript. Because we've loaded jQuery first on line 31, when it comes to line 34, our code is able to use jQuery functions because they've already been defined for us. So let's take a look at what that external JavaScript that I wrote, that's on my website, has in it, and how we're going to use that. Down at the bottom in lines 6 through 8 is the syntax for how we do work as soon as the web page is done loading. As soon as the web page is ready to go and ready to show to the user, line 6 is the way we give commands to the browser of what to do on that event. And so we use the jQuery selector, the $, open paren, we do an open paren, close paren, the equal, greater than is like an arrow, and then we have curly brackets. And what that is that's a function with no name, and that function gets run when the document is ready. What are we going to do when the document is ready? Well, the first line of code there says we are going to select all of the elements whose ID is the button. We only have one of those in our document as appropriate for an ID. And what we're going to do is we're going to attach a function to it. And so the action that we're going to use is called click. Now, click doesn't actually click the button. What click does is says what should happen when someone clicks on the button. And what we want to have happen is we want to have the button function be run. Now, notice that we only have the name of the button function here. We don't put the open and close parentheses after it like we would do if we wanted to run it right away. We're just giving it the name of the function that we want to run because it's not being run right now. we're attaching it to the button so that when the user clicks on the button, a function will be run. Well, then we can see what happens. On line 1 through 3, we can see that when the user clicks on the button, because we've attached it in line 7, the code in line 2 is going to get run. And we're going to see "you clicked me" get executed. So the functionality, again, is going to look exactly the same as the previous examples that we've used. But in this case, the way we've architected it is different. The function is being attached to the button through jQuery, and then it's being defined through an external JavaScript site. All of this is in the same JavaScript, external JavaScript. So here it is. This is our same website. Give me a second. Give it a second to load. And here we go. We click on "click me." It's okay. Click on the image. Nothing happens. We can click on the button a second time. Every time we click on the button, that function is going to get run. Same functionality so far. All right, example 5. Let's use jQuery in order to animate something. That's nice. It's a good user experience. It can make things look pretty professional if you do it well. If you're a graphic designer, I'm not, so it's not going to look that great, but you'll get the idea. What you can see here is that we've changed our document a little bit. Notice on line 16, there's no code attached to the "click me" button. We're going to do that in JavaScript. Line 28, we're loading the Bootstrap external library. Line 31, we're loading the jQuery external library. Line 34, we're loading an extra jQuery library. It turns out that jQuery breaks its library down into core functionality and then user interface functionality. And so the animations are part of the user interface functionality. So you can see we have 2 script tags that are including the first part of the library and the second part of the library, jQuery-UI. And then finally on line 37, we load up our code from our own file. And in that code, we have very similar text. Line 6, we're going to attach a function to our button. And more particularly, we're going to attach a function to those elements whose ID are the button. And what we've changed primarily here is line 2, which is that the work that we're going to do when the button is clicked is not to show that alert window. Instead, we're going to find all the elements in our document whose ID is the image, just one of them, the image that has the picture of the heart-shaped coffee beans. And the action that we're going to apply to it is the hide action. This is an animation. And it's possible to provide some information to jQuery about how you would like to hide it. So the first, you can look this up in the API, but the first component just says, like, how do you want to hide it? And what blind does is it does a sweep from right to left. The second one is a set of options about whether you want it to be horizontal or vertical or how you want it to sweep. And then the third component is how many milliseconds it's going to take to do that sweep. So they're all parameters about the animation. So a 5-second vertical, horizontal blinding effect. So let's take a look at what that's going to look like. Now remember, our effect is attached to our button. And when we click on our button, the action that we're going to take is on the images. So the function is attached to the button, but the action is applied to the image. Click on the button, and the image is blinded by jQuery. Once it's gone, the animation is done. We could click on it again, but the heart image isn't present, and so blinding it won't have any visual impact. Okay, example 6. Let's attach click actions to any element on the page. All right, so we're going to attach click elements not just to buttons, but we're going to attach click elements to our image as well. So our setup in terms of HTML is similar. We've got a button with no action on it in the HTML. We have one image. The button ID is the button, and the image ID is the image. We're loading up our Bootstrap code, our jQuery code, our jQuery UI code, and then the code for this particular example. The code for this particular example does 2 things when the document is done loading. It's attaching functions not just to the button, but it's also attaching a function to the image. The function that attaches to the button is called the button function, and the function that attaches to the image is called the image function. So when we click on the button, we're going to get an alert, as shown in line 2. And when we click on the image, we are going to find all of the elements called the image, and we're going to hide them using a fold animation that takes 5 seconds. So 2 different click actions have been attached to 2 different elements, and the result of clicking on them are 2 different actions as well. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Here's our general layout. First, we'll try clicking on the button and get the alert, and then we'll click on the image, and we see that we get the fold action. This demonstrates that you can attach a click option, a click operator, click function, to any element in the document object model. It doesn't just have to be a button. although it may not be a good user experience to just be able to click on anything. You can also see that we could click on the Click Me button multiple times, getting multiple alerts. And although in principle we could click on the image multiple times if there was any image there, once it's folded and gone away, there's nothing available to click on, although that function is still attached to the image. All right, let's look at example 7. We're going to cross-target some elements, or focus on this idea of cross-targeting elements. And by that I mean we're going to attach a function to one element such that clicking on that element affects a different element. All right, so we're going to change our layout a little bit here. Line 7, actually no, we're keeping our layout the same for example 7. 17 has a button with no actions. 24 has an image with nothing associated with it other than its IDs. The same scripts are being loaded, and this is what our external script looks like. Line 9, when our document is loaded, we're going to attach one function to the button and a second function to the image, lines 10 and 11. The function that gets run when the button gets clicked is going to change the size of the image. So when we click on the button, we're going to change the size of the image. And notice we're using the toggle action here. So that's going to make it go, the size effect, the size animation, makes it go down to a little dot. And then if you toggle it, it's going to, instead of hiding it, it will show it. So it'll go back and forth. And then the image function, when we click on the image, will give us a browser alert. So our button is targeting the image. Let's look at that. All right, so first we'll click on the image, and you see we get the alert. Now we'll click on the button and change the size of the heart. Nothing to click on now. We can click on the Click Me button again, and it would cause the heart to get larger. And then we could click on the heart again and get the alert if we wanted to. All right, example 8. In example 8, what we would like to do is target multiple elements. We saw in the lead up to this that you can use selectors to select multiple elements within our HTML document object model. Let's actually do that and see what it looks like. So we're going to change the layout of our HTML in this example. And what I want to draw your attention to is lines 19, line 24, line 29, and line 34. What we've done now is we've created 4 different buttons all next to each other in one row. The first one has an ID of the button 1, second the button 2, the button 3, and the button 4. Likewise, in our second row, we've placed 2 copies of our coffee bean image. The first one's called the image 1, has an ID image 1. The second one has an ID image 2. We're going to look at this in a horizontal form factor for our phone, and we're going to apply different JavaScript functions to it. The script tags are the same for this example. They're not on screen right now. They're cut off. But the external JavaScript that we're going to run looks like this. Notice down on line 38 that when our document has been completely loaded, what we're going to do is we're going to attach some functions to our buttons. Button 1, 2, 3, and 4 are each going to get their own unique function attached to them. And what happens when we click on button 1 is that we're going to find image 1 in our document according to ID, and we'll toggle it. Button 2 is going to find image 2 in our document and toggle it. Button 3, this is a little bit different, is going to find all the elements in our HTML document object model that have the class image-fluid. Now it turns out that both of our images use that class. So line 10 is going to target 2 different images at once. And then line 34 is going to use this variable that I described previously, and we're going to see what that does. What I want you to see about the this variable is in line 21, the this variable is going to refer to the button number 4 because it's like the parent of this function. The button number 4 owns the click on the button 4 function, and so it's going to pass out to the parent of that function. So let's take a look at what happens when we click on these different buttons. First of all, if we click on the images, nothing happens. There's nothing associated with them. If we click on target image 1, it goes away and comes back. Image 2 goes away and comes back. All images causes both images to go away and then come back. And then if we target this, we actually cause the button to go away. This refers to the element that's holding the function. And so because this object identifier was attached to that button, the thing that had the jQuery action applied to it was the button itself. Another example that we haven't talked about much in CSS is targeting wildcard elements. And that's using placeholders in order to reference multiple elements. So this is kind of a crazy CSS example too. Same structure as before, except that this time I've called the buttons button 1, button 2, button 3, button 4, as far as the text that the user is going to see. And then we have our 2 images as well. The JavaScript that we're going to run externally is this funky JavaScript. What we see on line 6 is that we're going to attach a function to some elements in our HTML. What elements are we going to attach it to? Well, we have this really elaborate path. The greater than symbol means an immediate descendant. So we're going to find any HTML tags that have a child of the body tag, that have a child with the class container fluid, that have a child with the class row, that have a child with the class column, that have a div tag as a child, and anything in that position, that's what the star means, will have the function attached to it. So we're going to select anything in our document that meets this criteria, a very specific path through our tree, and we're going to attach the function on line 1 through 3 to it. This function, 1 through 3, is going to hide an element. And what element is it going to hide? It's going to hide this element, which means it's going to hide whichever element that contains the function. So let's see what that looks like. Here's the example of our code halfway through the clicking. I clicked on the second coffee bean icon and it's hiding. So we click on the button goes away. The image, third button goes away. The image goes away. The first button goes away. And the fourth button goes away. Now, in principle, we would be able to get them to come back if there was something else to click on, but in this case, there isn't. This is to demonstrate how the this variable works, and also demonstrate that you can apply the same function to any elements on the document object model, and it has whatever effect the jQuery effect has. So finally, actually, I think this is example 10, not example 9, but in this example, let's try and put all these things together to do something a little bit more helpful. Our buttons are now labeled show 1, show 2, show 3, and show 4, and we've got 2 different coffee bean hearts. The text that we're going to, or the functionality, the interactivity that we're going to put in our HTML document entails finding all of the buttons in our document object model and attaching the same button function to them. We're going to find all the images in our document object model and attach the same image function to them. What happens when we click on the button function? We find all the image fluid class objects and we show them. What happens when we click on any image? We hide whichever image we've clicked on. All right, so the action is show for buttons and the action is hide when we click on images. The button function targets multiple elements. The image function only targets the image that holds the function. So when we run this, this is what it ends up looking like. Click on a heart, it goes away. Click on show, the images come back. Click on the other show, the images come back. Click on the other image and show, they come back. Click on both of the images, individually they go away, and show, they both come back. All right, so this is just a little bit of an introduction of how we can use jQuery in order to give functionality and interactivity to our web applications. And primarily, I'm demonstrating this through the process of attaching functions to different elements in our document object model. And the result of those functions is hiding or showing elements. That's because that's sort of most clear to see the effect. But the actions that could happen when you click on elements could be varied. They could initiate network interactions. They could initiate just data changes or calculations. They could initiate a form validation, all kinds of different operations. jQuery is very elaborate. There's both the jQuery core library and the jQuery UI library. There's actually a couple other libraries as well. And they're all available for you to peruse on api.jquery.com. It's helpful to poke through it just to sort of get a sense of what the scope of things that are possible to do with jQuery is. Finally, what I would like to show you is how we've been using this already in the code that we've been doing as part of this sequence in our Reversi application. We have a little bit of code that responds to the server in main.js. Main.js is code that's run in our client, and so it has a document object model associated with it. And what it does is it creates buttons whenever someone joins the room. So let's break this down a little bit and see what we were actually doing now that we know a little bit more about jQuery. So first of all, we know that jQuery works with a selector and an action. So let's look at line 39. We've got that work happening right there. So our selector is going to find all the elements in our document object model that have an ID with an attribute of messages. We're going to do that by looking for hashtag messages in a string in the selector on line 39. The action that we're going to do is we're going to prepend some HTML to that particular node. Our action is to prepend HTML to whatever node in the tree we've selected. So that happens right there. What HTML are we actually going to prepend? Well, in line 36, we construct it from variables that we have available to us. What that string ends up constructing is something that looks like this. P class quote join room response class, Don, maybe, if that's what the username variable is set to, join the lobby, there are two, maybe, if that's what the payload count variable is set to, users in this room, close p tag. We're going to take that, store it in the variable new string, we're going to provide that to jQuery, and jQuery is then going to take that little bit of HTML and augment our document object model by prepending it to any elements in our tree that have the ID messages. Because it's an ID, there should only be one. But this is the way that we add things into the text of our HTML. As soon as line 39 is run, the user will see this in the browser. There it is, new string. All right, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The three languages and components that make up a website that has content presented in a particular way and with interactivity. jQuery builds on JavaScript in order to provide it more functionality. JavaScript adds the interactivity to web pages, and jQuery makes it easier by providing a simple cross-browser syntax and powerful actions that help us to manipulate the document object model. All right, this is a little bit of a long haul lecture, so thank you for your attention. I appreciate your patience in working through it. I hope this helps you to understand a little bit how the interactivity in web pages is created and give you a source from which you can learn when you want to add additional interactivity to web pages that you're working on. Thank you for your attention.